Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with yesterday's press conference at Trump's golf resort in Florida, at which he made little sense and appeared to contradict himself after saying he would only accept an unconditional surrender from Iran, announcing that the war would be over in a week or so. Joining us to discuss how much Trump's one-hour phone call with Putin before the press conference influenced Trump's change of mind is Jonathan Guyer, Program Director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group, a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He is an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt, a regular contributor at The New Republic, New York Magazine, and The Guardian, among others. He has an article at the American Prospect. We will discuss the blowback from an unpopular Iran war. Then we'll examine whether the so-called dead man walking, Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, will reverse his father's fatwa against building nuclear weapons, and speak with Dr. Annelle Sheline, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She has worked as a journalist in Egypt and Yemen and served as a foreign affairs officer in the Office of Near Eastern Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor until resigning over then-President Biden's policy on the war in Gaza. We will discuss her article at the New Republic, The Unbelievable Madness of Our War with Iran. Then finally, we'll get a military analysis of both the Iran war and the Russia-Ukraine war from Jennifer Kavanaugh, a senior fellow and director of military analysis at Defense Priorities, where her research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure and defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Previously, she was a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she has an article at Responsible Statecraft. We will discuss, is Iran peace toast now that the Middle East is on fire? And before we begin with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now, Jonathan Guyer, who's the Program Director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group, a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He's an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt and is a regular contributor at the New Republic, the New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others, and he has an article at the American Prospect, The Blowback from an Unpopular Iran War. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jonathan Guyer.
Thank you, Ian.
So, Jonathan, after watching Trump's press conference at his golf resort down in Florida yesterday, I'm left with the impression that this is a man who doesn't know what he's doing, and his military and foreign policy acumen is about as good as his medical advice that he gave during COVID, which is to shine a light inside your body and drink bleach. So I have zero confidence in this man knowing what he's doing. Yet, you know, the press didn't ask him any really hard questions. They certainly didn't ask him about having spent an hour that day talking to Putin on the phone and suddenly reversing himself, where he had said that the only way the war would end would be with an unconditional surrender. And now, after talking to Putin, he's talking about, maybe a week or so it'll be all over. So it felt to me like he was checking in with the boss. Can you explain what happened there?
Well, I mean, it does seem to me that this war is incredibly unpopular and, will almost certainly have a big toll for the Republican Party in the midterms this fall. And I think that may be a function of how this administration is totally waffling between different reasons, pretexts, excuses for why the United States and Israel have bombed Iran, what they see as the end game, which, as you say, Ian, I've seen no plausible explanation or idea. It makes the Iraq War seem like a very efficient endeavor. Not that I want to compliment, President Bush's illegal invasion by any means, but just the fact of the matter of how unpopular this war is from the first week is pretty shocking. But I did want to correct the record on one thing, which is a colleague from the New York Times, Sean McCreesh, I thought had a great question to President Trump in the press conference, I believe it was yesterday, where he really pressed him on these Tomahawk missiles that reportedly struck this girls' school in Iran, just hundreds of girls killed and injured in the first act of this invasion. So I just think this demands a tremendous amount of attention. Obviously, the forensic investigations teams at many leading journalistic outlets are looking into what missiles were used, how to use it through satellite imagery and so forth to understand the U.S. role in this strike. But truly, this is allegedly a truly heinous crime to begin what's already a heinous war. And I guess my takeaway here would be that strike on the girls' school in Iran demands as much attention as anything else we've seen in the Middle East in recent years.
Well, that was a pretty surreal moment, I must admit, where Trump was confronted by the fact that there's a picture of a Tomahawk missile. And by the way, that was a double tap strike. After they killed all those girls, they also killed a bunch of parents rushing in to find what happened to their kids. But the long and the short of it is Trump said, Tomahawks are used by many countries and that Iran has some Tomahawks. And that's when the reporter from the New York Times you mentioned said, no, wait a minute. He said, you just suggested that Iran somehow got its hands on a Tomahawk and bombed its own elementary school on the first day of the war. You're the only person in your government saying this. And then
Precisely.
Trump says, because I don't know enough about it, I think it's something that I was told is under investigation. Again, total incoherence. But what about Putin's call? The conventional wisdom is that Putin is rubbing his hands with glee, that he's the only winner in this terrible war so far because the price of oil and gas is skyrocketing. So why would Putin, which we assume happened in the phone call because Trump reversed himself, why would he want Trump to end this war quickly?
I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think the president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations put it well, Richard Haass, former Bush administration official, saying that it seems like all of the courtesies offered to Putin are not on offer to the Iranians in these negotiations. So it would seem to me that the U.S. and Iran were very close to negotiating some kind of nuclear arrangement just 2 weeks ago. Whereas this Trump administration is so willing to deal with Putin and offer him all sorts of goodies. Now I can't really speak to why President Putin would be so keen on this war ending, but I do think the destructive knock-on effects and the unknown unknowns, as Mr. Rumsfeld famously called it, could be very detrimental even to Mr. Putin's government. I mean, this is just a cataclysmic series of events, and I think it's something like 14 countries have already been pulled in one way or another, being struck by Israel, the United States, Iran, and all of these potential detrimental effects could be really damaging. And I don't think, maybe in the short term, it's very pleasant for Mr. Putin to have a kind of one-upsmanship in this geopolitical arena. But I think any rational, logical leader would see that this could get out of hand very quickly. And of course, the nuclear potential of escalation is absolutely frightening. People are saying this may be the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of potential escalation. So even a very pugnacious leader like Mr. Putin may be able to see the need to end this war as rapidly as possible.
Well, the Secretary of War, as he calls himself, Hegseth, is now saying that today is going to be the biggest bombing day, and I must say, he's quite gleeful about killing people, and it seems unseemly to be the Secretary of Defense. I don't think any Secretary of Defense ever in this country's history has been so bloodthirsty. But the long and the short of it is, General Kane, who's one of the few adults around, he said the other day that they're not just going after their missiles, and they've obviously sunk their navy, not that they really had much of a navy, but what they're doing now is going after the basic industrial infrastructure of the country, and by striking oil and then electricity. And so that would indicate that, in fact, Steve Simon at the Responsible Statecraft has written about this, saying that basically this goes back to Henry Morgenthau during World War II, when he drafted a plan to basically bomb Germany back to the Stone Age to literally get rid of its industrial infrastructure. So if that is a strategy, then this is pretty radical, isn't it? To really basically, this is a pretty advanced, educated country, and the idea that you want to bomb them back to the Stone Age is pretty brutal.
It's pretty brutal, and to me, it's very reminiscent of Vietnam and the bombing of Laos and Cambodia. And I think what's been missing so far in the United States is a peace movement that's responding to it. And that's sort of my big question is there is a huge amount of unpopularity for these strikes. And Americans, according to the polling my organization has done, want Congress to take a much bigger role in foreign policy. It is their constitutional duty, and they haven't really played that role of accountability, the US Congress. But the question is, what will get people to the streets, or what levers of accountability are there to make sure this war doesn't continue to expand? And waiting until the ballot box in November is quite a long time as this president continues to turn to militarism, this rise of neo-imperialistic policies. His domestic agenda very much has stalled, but the president has a very free hand, it seems, on foreign policy. And as you say, he's really leaning into the moniker of Department of War, and it's absolutely frightening.
But the other thing that he talked about at this press conference yesterday at his golf course was the SAVE Act. He made a big pitch for the SAVE Act. So that's where I think there's complicity with the House and Senate Republicans, although it's the Senate Republicans who have to make the decision to get rid of the filibuster, and we're told that they don't want to do that. But Trump is clearly putting pressure on them. So I think there's a total complicity there, particularly with the House Republicans. They want to stay in power, and the only way they're going to stay in power is to cheat, not compete. That's what the SAVE Act is all about. It's about cheating. But the sort of mendacious part of it is that on the surface it sounds reasonable. Yes, of course you should have an ID when you vote to prove that you're the person, you're a citizen, and you're able to vote. But it's a solution to a non-existent problem. And its real motive is that, millions of Americans don't have passports and birth certificates, and they won't be able to vote. And that's exactly what the intention is. So at the end of the day, Jonathan, what Trump is counting on is essentially the stupidity of the American public to swallow these lies, which sound on the surface reasonable, but they're not. It's a cynical trick.
And it's an absolutely worrisome, cynical trick. I think Matt Duss, the former advisor to Bernie Sanders, said it well, was that the lack of accountability for the Iraq war planners of the Bush administration has a very direct line to this moment. I think, I don't know if getting them in jail would have been realistic, but having a real reckoning, a real truth and reconciliation, and just informing the public about the lies that got us into the Second Gulf War of 2003 would have really gone a long way in staving off future reckless conflicts that we're now very much a part of. And the fact that that hasn't happened and there hasn't been a Vietnam level reckoning with the Iraq war leads us to this moment where civilian deaths are skyrocketing Iran. As you mentioned, Ian, the fact that infrastructure and possibly desalination plants and so forth could be targets. The fact that a humanitarian disaster is happening right now in Cuba, and somehow the conversation in Washington is Cuba next? The fact that Venezuela seems to be entirely on pause. These are all very much connected, and this turn to intense militarism in President Trump's second year is sort of without precedent in terms of the rapidness with which these conflicts are accelerating. And I really hope that Congress, the Senate, finds its voice, because if it doesn't, we're going to find ourselves in a radically different United States of America.
But we talked earlier about Trump's response to the picture of the Tomahawk missile, where he made this ridiculous statement that Iran has these missiles, Tomahawks, which, you can't buy them off the shelf. They're not they're not distributed like candy around the world. They're hard to come by, and only America's closest allies have them. But the fact that he just instantly, with such alacrity, lied. He lies as easily as he breathes. I think that's the problem.
Isn't truth so often the first casualty of these wars? To me, the scandal, of course, is the bombing, but also the cover-up, and it seems very obvious between the contrast of what Secretary of War / Defense Hegseth is saying versus the president, and so forth. I recently saw the number 3 at the Pentagon speak, and all he wanted to do was defer to the secretary. No one wants to get ahead of these principles because it's a real culture of deferring to the president. But as you say, it's not very clear the president knows up from down, left for right, or even what a Tomahawk missile is.
So when you talked about, Jonathan, the need for the peace movement to step up here, what do you think is happening in terms of so many issues involved in trying to get rid of this regime? And I get a feeling that people are sort of floundering around trying to come up with a strategy. There doesn't seem to be very strong leadership in the Democratic Party and a lot of direction. There are some young stars emerging like Mondani and Tallarico in Texas, but that'll take a long time for them to, get to the top of the party. What's holding back the opposition in this country? Because we've never had such a reckless and unpopular president, and he's 6 out of 10 already oppose this war. So in a democratic country, that's a substantial majority, but they don't have a voice.
Absolutely. And I think this goes to 2 points I would make. First, the kind of structural side of things, that foreign policy has been such an elite game since World War II. It's been so separated off from domestic policy. And even in the midst of the Iraq War, where there were massive protests, U.S. politicians are just not responsive on foreign policy. They're seen as the guardians or the blob and so forth. But I do think the other point is that there was such an intensive crackdown on the Gaza protests surrounding Israel's operations there, U.S. involvement on college campuses. Some of those protests are still ongoing, but there was such retribution, such legal pushback. Of course, Columbia University sent in the NYPD. So while we are seeing, I think, a broader, longer-term change in the Democratic Party with the rising stars like Mayor Mamdani, who you mentioned, there still was a pretty repressive crackdown and a lot of difficulties at this moment. Just walking through the streets of Washington, D.C., there's still National Guard in the streets. It's quite a threatening moment. So there is going to have to be some kind of rejuvenation of this protest movement, I think, because lawmakers seem very unable or unwilling to stand up to the president.
Well, just in the last couple of minutes, though, the repressive machinery that Trump has, he has his own private army of these ICE thugs. ICE has changed its tactics now. They're now not just going after immigrants, they're going after the protesters.
Well, and journalists, I believe, to some extent.
Right. So they're quite proactive. So do you think that's already having a chilling effect?
Well, and I think we've seen chilling effects in a variety of arenas, law firms, nonprofits, universities. It's an incredibly challenging moment for free speech in this country. And, I spent many years reporting on speech and news and politics in the Middle East and trying to understand the limits of free expression. And absolutely scary that these things are happening right here today in the United States. But I do think these key institutions can be strengthened through people power, a peace movement. These things take time. I don't know if people will be jumping into the streets tomorrow, but if you look at the longer term trends and you look at the deep unpopularity of this war already, it seems almost an inevitability that the pushback is emerging.
But just in closing, the one area where Trump is not unpopular, and that is amongst the billionaire class who are buying up our media. So isn't that a problem when you've got Larry Ellison and Elon Musk and the richest people in this country controlling our media? Do you think that is also having a chilling effect in the sense that they are force multipliers of Trump's fascist agenda?
Well, the media moment, I'd say, Ian, is very complex. It's so fragmented that we've seen such consolidation among these tycoons, but also so much so the rise of independent media, Substack, so many incredible independent magazines and outlets doing deep reporting, a kind of almost a golden age of investigative reporting with these outlets, kind of small ProPublica style outlets doing work on this administration. So I don't think the media is entirely a negative story. But yes, the kind of mass media as we knew it that helped cultivate those Walter Cronkite moments is very much over.
Well, Jonathan Guy, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Jonathan Guy, who's a program director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group, a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He is an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt, and he's a regular contributor to The New Republic, New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others, and has an article at the American Prospect, The Blowback from an Unpopular Iran War. We're going to take a brief station break. Get back examining whether the so-called dead man walking, Iran's new supreme leader Moshtaba Khamenei, will reverse his father's fatwa against building nuclear weapons. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Dr. Annelle Sheline, who is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She has worked as a journalist in Egypt and Yemen, and has served as a foreign affairs officer in the Office of Near Eastern Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, until resigning over then President Biden's policy on the war in Gaza. And she has an article at the New Republic, The Unbelievable Madness of Our War with Iran. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Annelle Sheline.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And in spite of the enormous amount of destruction being rained down on Iran by both Israel and the United States, it still seems like an asymmetrical war in which the victim may have certain advantages. It costs $4 million to shoot down a $20,000 drone, and our inventories apparently are getting thinner. The U.S. is now moving Patriot batteries from South Korea, much to the alarm of the South Koreans, to the Middle East. So it seems to me that there's not a lot of logic in this war. There's no clear strategy being enunciated. There's all kinds of different versions coming from different people, particularly Trump himself, who at his press conference yesterday made absolutely no sense. So it would seem that all the Iranians have to do is stay in the fight. And on the American side, the only way that you could really win the war in terms of stopping the nuclear program, which is supposedly the main driver, would be to send boots on the ground to find the 440 kilos of fissile material and secure it. And I don't believe the United States is willing nor are its allies, for putting so many troops on the ground in a hostile territory. So is there any logic here? Do you see any sensible escape plan, or is this just a brutal punishment of a country that's for 40 years has called us the Great Satan?
Yes, I mean, to everything you said, I think it is primarily this mentality of needing to punish Iran, this ongoing sense that the Islamic Republic humiliated the United States 47 years ago with the hostage crisis, and there are certain components of the U.S. foreign policy establishment that have never gotten over that and have wanted to punish Iran ever since. And someone showed me a political cartoon of Trump opening Pandora's box and him saying, they said it couldn't be done, I opened it in 5 minutes, just that Netanyahu finally found a US president stupid enough to open Pandora's box and unleash this chaos, not only upon the region, but upon the whole world. When you think about the price of oil, fertilizer passing through, what this is going to do as farmers around the world are trying to plant their crops, given that it's early spring in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, and then hearing, Gulf countries are already reducing their capacity because there's nowhere to store the oil, because there's nowhere for it to go. And so that will take months to kind of get oil wells back up to the production levels that where they were previously operating. I mean, even if by some miracle Trump decided to declare victory and walk away, and by some other miracle the Iranians also decided to declare victory and walk away, it would still be months. And yet what we're looking at is that outcome of sort of declaring mission accomplished is very unlikely, especially on the Iranian side.
So your colleague at the Quincy Institute, Steve Simon, I've been exchanging emails with him, and he's got a piece at Responsible Statecraft suggesting that the General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has enunciated what he called the Morgenthau strategy from World War II, when Morgenthau, working with the FDR, came up with this plan to destroy Germany's industrial infrastructure, to literally bomb them back to the Stone Age. And Steve thinks that that's what's happening with the Israeli and the American bombing campaign, which today, by the way, the so-called Secretary of War said we're really ramping it up. So they're going after factories, electricity, desalination, oil depots, etc. Is that what's happening? In other words, they really want to bomb this place back to the Stone Age, and the rest be damned.
I think my colleague Steve may be giving them a bit too much credit. I don't know if they would have read about the Morgenthau doctrine. I think what they're adopting is the Dahiya doctrine, the Israeli doctrine of completely disproportional death and destruction merely for its own sake. And when although you're correct that we're not hearing a clear strategy because we keep hearing different things coming out of various U.S. officials. But I think what really the U.S. is pursuing is this Israeli approach of just murder as many people as you can. But I mean, in Israel's context, they are motivated by the demographic concern, that this genocidal demographic concern about the population of Palestinians and the need to eliminate them from land that Israelis covet. Whereas in Iran, I mean, it makes no sense. The population of Iran poses no threat to the United States. To be clear, the population of Palestine would also not pose a threat to Israel if they ended their occupation, but just, that's their logic, that they want to eliminate Palestinians by whatever means necessary. Whereas in Iran, this absolute destruction is only harming the region, harming the Gulf, harming the rest of the world, and ultimately harming American dominance. I mean, you think about the number of countries now, but also previously in the past, in the first year of Trump's second term, that have been faced with a stark reality that it is foolish to rely on the United States, whether it's for economically, given the tariffs, or from a security perspective, given, as you said, South Korea is quite alarmed. I imagine Taiwan is feeling quite alarmed. The European countries, likewise, Ukraine. So the the fact that so much of the world had depended for so long on a US government that at least nominally was motivated by some understanding of the global good. And I don't want to be rosy-eyed about it because obviously so many US administrations have pursued policies that are extremely violent and detrimental. But there were still, I mean, this kind of gets at what Prime Minister Carney said at Davos, where sort of, for those of us, we Canadians, for example, or Europeans who had benefited from this system that the US set up and were willing to sort of look away when the U.S. went after countries that were in its way, and just the sort of the fiction of all of that has been so starkly revealed. I mean, I for the sake of the world, I hope that countries are reconsidering their reliance on the United States because I fear Trump may not be the last U.S. president to behave in this manner.
Well, I don't know that there are any examples of American presidents behaving in the way that Trump has done, at least on two occasions, where he's appeared to be negotiating in good faith and then used the negotiations as a trick to
Exactly.
start bombing people. He's done that twice now with Iran. So I don't imagine there are too many countries in the world that are going to trust any negotiation with Trump.
Exactly. And that is exactly what Israel wants, that they, especially when it comes to Iran, they don't want Iran to see the US, to see negotiations as a possible outlet. They want the Iranians to completely mistrust the United States, to respond with violence, knowing that the United States will respond with overwhelming violence. Israel has no interest in Trump reaching any sort of negotiated settlement with Iran. And as you said, now Iran would be quite foolish to believe Trump, but believe the promise of negotiations yet again.
So then what happened yesterday in Trump's hour-long conversation with Putin? To me, it feels like he's checking in with the boss, and the boss told him to end the war, which contradicts his earlier statement of saying he would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. So what happened there? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense. I thought Putin was taking advantage of the windfall in the rise in the price of oil and gas and wanted this war to keep going.
Uh, I mean, yes, I mean, I agree that Putin has really benefited as a result, and so I don't, I wouldn't necessarily attribute Trump's. I mean, again, Trump's all over the place, so you can't really attach too much importance to any single thing that he says. In addition to the fact that we've heard rumors from various outlets about the mobilization of U.S. troops, as you said, this cockamamie scheme to maybe send in troops to remove the 440 kilos of fissile material. Clearly, they are all over the place, other than the Dahiya doctrine of just trying to destroy as much as possible, or if we're being generous, the Morgenthau doctrine.
So in your article at the New Republic, Annelle, The Unbelievable Madness of Our War with Iran, you point out that Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, who some describe as a dead man walking because the Israelis want to kill him, but nevertheless, he may well be a big departure from his father. After all, in the killing of his father, he lost not just his father, but his mother, his wife, his daughter, his sister-in-law, and his niece. So he may well be motivated to tear up Khamenei Sr.'s 2003 fatwa against the production of nuclear weapons. I don't see that they have any other choice, do they? I mean, if they survive this, won't that be their top priority to go nuclear?
Yes, I mean, you would one would assume so, right? And as you said, the concern is that, sort of like the Norman Finkelstein quip about the U.S. spent, if you ever feel ineffective, just remember it took 20 years, trillions of dollars, for the United States to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. And so, you think about if the war thus far is costing $3 billion a day for the United States, if not more, to replace Ayatollah Khamenei with Ayatollah Khamenei and as well, and just the destruction of the region. It's I mean, it is truly mind-boggling. And I think a crucial point that I think needs to be made is the inability of the world, and in particular, I'm looking at Europe, to hold Israel accountable for its horrific war crimes, atrocities, and genocide in Gaza, and their refusal to uphold international law, despite things like the ICJ's 2024 ruling that the occupation of Palestine was indeed illegal and that all countries had a legal obligation to work to hold Israel accountable for those violations. If, and I mean, knowing that Trump, well, and Biden too, were doing everything they could to shield Israel. Like I know that it would have, the countries would have paid a cost to try to hold Israel accountable. And yet this is what we're seeing. This is what the world is reaping, is because they did not hold Israel accountable for those violations. And then when the US also went after the ICC, is trying to destroy these institutions that could have held Israelis and Americans accountable for all kinds of war crimes, not only in Gaza, but you think about US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world. Now this is what has resulted is just a further erosion of international law, of the US not even bothering to come up with a credible justification for why there was some need to attack Iran. And just the need for the world to enforce international law, to uphold these institutions that are supposed to keep humanity safe and prevent things like the crime of aggression. I mean, I just hope that this is all just becoming more clear. And this is part of what I got to observe over last week. I was in the Netherlands for a meeting of the Hague Group, which 40 countries joined, which is up from a year ago when they only had 8 countries join, which is dedicated to holding Israel accountable for its violations of international law. And my hope is that the world will come together to say to the United States and to Israel that this is unacceptable, that you must obey international law and cannot conduct these sorts of crimes. I doubt that that's going to happen, and it may merely be, the price that is paid is through Republicans' electoral chances in the midterms and, the price Americans are paying at the pump. But I hope that the countries of the world are just rethinking their reliance on the United States.
So, just in the last couple of minutes, then, Annelle, you point out in your article that the Gulf states are furious with Trump for sacrificing their safety and economic viability for a war that will result either in complete chaos in Iran that could destabilize the entire region, or the survival of a regime that is even more hostile, paranoid, and determined to go nuclear. And you quote an Emirati billionaire who, in response to Senator Lindsey Graham, said, "I say to him clearly, we know full well why we are under attack, and we also know who dragged the entire region into this dangerous escalation without consulting those he calls his allies in the region." So I guess that means no more billions to the Trump family coming from the Gulf.
I mean, yes, that's what you've heard, that the wealthy Gulf monarchies are considering rescinding all of these major investments in the US economy, certainly to these big Trump projects, or, the Saudis completely funding Jared Kushner's investment schemes. I can understand their sense of betrayal and rage, because they paid a lot of money to, thinking that they had a president that they could sort of control through corruption, to have his ear, thinking that he would, kind of listen to them. And you think back to last May, when Trump went to the Gulf and said things, was so critical of the nation building, the interventionism of previous US presidents. And I'm sure the Gulf leaders were all congratulating each other. Finally, we've got a US president who speaks our language, who understands. And now here we are.
Well, I thank you very much for joining us here today, Dr. Annelle Sheline.
Thank you so much for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Dr. Annelle Sheline, who's a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She's worked as a journalist in Egypt and Yemen, and served as a foreign affairs officer at the Office of Near Eastern Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, until resigning over then President Biden's policy on the war in Gaza. And she has an article at the New Republic, The Unbelievable Madness of Our War with Iran. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with a military analysis of both the Iran war and the Russia-Ukraine war, and how much Ukraine peace is toast now that the Middle East is on fire.
Tonight, two great ships will pull back to their ports, depleted of everything that shoots flames and reports. And in the morning, the shells will wash up on the shore, and the mighty of earth will have no other recourse but to shiver and shake and make.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Jennifer Kavanaugh, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, where her research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure and defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Previously, she was a Senior Fellow at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Is Ukraine Peace Toast, Now That the Middle East is on Fire? Welcome to Background Briefing, Jennifer Kavanaugh.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And your colleague at the Quincy Institute, Steve Simon, has a piece now suggesting that General Kane's recent speech, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, reminded him of Morgenthau's doctrine of during World War II of just destroying Germany's industrial and civilian infrastructure to the point where you bomb them back to the Stone Age. And Steve was basically suggesting that that's the only thing that makes sense about what the U.S. is doing now to Iran. What do you think of that scenario?
It's hard to argue with that. The United States has hit, I think, 5,000 targets as of yesterday, including military and energy infrastructure. And yet this morning, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth suggested this was going to be the most intense day of bombing. So it's just hard to imagine what the strategy is other than to try to take out as much of Iran's economic and military industrial base as possible to weaken the regime to the point where if it doesn't collapse, Iran just becomes so incapacitated that it is just incapable of posing a threat to any other country in the region.
But it seems already that there's an advantage that Iran has in terms of asymmetrical warfare when you consider that we use these $4 million interceptors to shoot down $20,000 Iranian drones, and that in this asymmetrical war, Iran just has to stay in the fight while we can only win at a price we are unlikely to want to pay, and that is putting boots on the ground to literally seize the 440 kilograms of fissile material, even if we could find it.
Well, I think you're definitely correct that Iran has a significant asymmetric advantage here. Now, the United States isn't only using $4 million interceptors to intercept these drones. They do have a range of different short range air defense capabilities, including some that are specifically targeted to drones that are much cheaper. But the fact remains that all Iran needs to do to stay in this fight is launch a few hundred drones every day towards US bases and energy infrastructure in the Gulf region. And that imposes significant costs on the US military and US Gulf partners at a very low cost to Iran. And Iran doesn't actually need missile launchers or even that much economic or defense industrial base capability to keep this up. And this instability will be enough to keep oil tankers from really wanting to take the risk of transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. So Iran is able to impose significant costs on the region, on the United States, and on the global economy at a very low cost. And there's not all that much the US can do about it unless it's willing to send in a massive ground presence, which to this point the president has not been willing to do.
So in terms of the tankers going through the Straits of Hormuz, Trump recently said to the crews and captains of these ships, show some guts. I mean, would you want to be aboard a massive explosive ship going through a war zone?
I mean, would I? Definitely not. But the bigger problem here with Trump's suggestion is that it's not really just a question of these specific ship captains or crews. The problem here is the insurance companies, which are refusing to insure the tankers, which makes it too high a financial risk for the actual owners of these tankers, the large companies that manage shipping at the global level, to really support the passage of these ships through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not about the captains having the guts. It's a financial risk calculation that's based almost entirely on the fact that the insurance companies have said we are not going to cover the policies of or the losses should there be such an attack in the future.
So, Jennifer, what did you make of the press conference at Trump's Gulf Resort yesterday, where prior to that, he had a 1-hour phone conversation with Vladimir Putin. And in the midst of this press conference, which was all over the place, and I didn't think that our press corps equipped themselves very effectively. For example, one of the journalists asked about his conversation with Putin, but didn't mention the fact about recent reports saying that Putin was providing Iran with targeting information to strike U.S. ships, planes, and troop concentrations, which I would have thought was an important question to ask. But nevertheless, what happened there? Why did Trump, after talking to Putin, appear to reverse himself, having said that he would only accept unconditional surrender of Iran, to now saying, at least yesterday, that, oh, it'll be over in a week or so, you know?
Well, the Trump administration has been all over the place in terms of their objectives and the duration of this operation. They've suggested that the goal is to take out the military infrastructure, take out the Navy. Sometimes they suggest that it's regime change. Sometimes they suggest it's unconditional surrender. Trump has even pointed to the possibility of some kind of nation building activity inside Iran after the conflict. So I don't really get a sense that the administration has a plan. They don't know how long the war is going to be. They don't know how close we are to finishing. They don't really know what the goals are. And they've made very little effort to provide a coherent narrative to the American people. Now, I don't know if I would link Trump's statements necessarily to the call with Putin as much as to the oil markets and the fact that oil prices really spiked, and that Trump's comments were intended to sort of calm the markets and calm the oil price, especially by suggesting that this would just be a short-term disruption, that things would be back on track in the near future. And, as we know, markets are based mostly on expectations. So by providing this expectation that this would be short, that this would be over soon, I think the hope was to reduce the financial impact. Now, this did work, except that then he, at the same time was saying that we haven't won enough. And we have Hegseth this morning saying that, we're continuing with really intense strikes. Now, I do think that Putin in the call, at least my understanding is that he's trying to play a diplomatic role here, to play an intermediary, not only between the Gulf states and Iran, but also between Iran and the United States, and to provide some ideas about how this conflict might be de-escalated. And perhaps that weighed into wade into Trump's comments a little bit. On the intelligence sharing issue, I agree it's a question I would have asked if I were a reporter. At the same time, when the administration has been asked in other contexts, they've kind of suggested that it's not a big deal. Witkoff today suggested that it was inaccurate. But just being realistic, I mean, this is what the United States is doing in Ukraine, is providing intelligence to help the Ukrainians target better. So we have to expect that Russia is doing the same thing for Iran in the case of the United States.
So let's turn to your article, Responsible Statecraft, Jennifer Kavanaugh. Is Ukraine peace toast now that the Middle East is on fire? Obviously, Trump has always seemed to favor Russia in these talks and doesn't make any distinction between Ukraine being the victim and Russia being the aggressor. If anything, he seems to be harder on Ukraine than he is on Russia. So what do you think his motives are all about?
Well, I think that Trump genuinely does want to end the war. I think he rightly assesses that he has a lot more leverage over Ukraine than he does over Russia. Most of the tools that Trump has, economic or military aid, are going to affect Putin's calculations only really on the margin. The Iran war really takes some of those tools off the table. The United States has now had to lift some sanctions on Russian oil, is encouraging India to buy Russian oil, has stopped its campaign against Russia's shadow fleet. So it has actually lost leverage in the economic space, and in the military space similarly, as it expends significant defense material and munitions, offense and defensive, in the Middle East. It has less military equipment to provide Ukraine. So at this point, the United States has lost even the tiny leverage it had over Russia, whereas on the Ukraine side, Ukraine is still the weaker party and is still more dependent on the United States for certain things like intelligence, logistics, and especially air defense. So I think he rightly assesses that he can put more pressure on Zelensky. We also know that he doesn't like Zelensky, going back to his first term, and I'm sure that plays into it. And more generally, Trump is clearly much more comfortable dealing with strongman leaders like Putin, Orban, Xi Jinping, and others like them than he is with dealing with people like Zelensky or his European counterparts.
So what explains, though, the fact that the Ukrainians have held on, and there's even reports that they've actually taken back some territory? Is it to do with the basic morale of the soldiers on both sides? In other words, on the Russian side, the BBC were reporting recently from a couple of Russian defectors how routinely Russian officers shoot Russian soldiers who don't want to go into the meat grinder and be slaughtered. And they've even the reports of soldiers being tied to trees in no man's land, left to die. Apparently the bodies of Russian soldiers that have been killed just lay there rotting. Whereas on the Ukrainian side, it appears that they're highly motivated, even though they've been stuck on the front for years on end. There was an interesting documentary called 2,000 Meters to Androvika that really the camera was right there on the front line. It was absolutely amazing footage, but it indicated the difference in the morale. The Ukrainians, were shouting out to the Russians who were just feet away, saying, "Why have you come to our country to destroy us? Go home." I mean, I don't know whether that's not, I know military strategy talks about hardware and all kinds of, maps and stuff like that. But I'm just wondering at a basic level why the Ukrainians have managed to hold off a country with enormous resources and 3 times the population or 4 times the population. Has a lot to do with the motivation of the soldiers and the leadership of the soldiers at the front.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, obviously for Ukraine, this is a truly existential conflict where they feel that their sovereignty is at risk. They're fighting for their own territory, and so they certainly have a lot more determination and will in staying power. They are also better led and commanded, and increasingly over time better organized as well. I think, the nature of warfare today is that even small countries can be very effective using asymmetric capabilities. The role of drones has played as a significant factor in Ukraine's success, allowing them to freeze the line in certain places using kill zones that makes it very hard for Russia to move forward at all. And even though Ukraine's manpower is a challenge and gaps have emerged in their battlefield lines, Russia hasn't been able to take advantage of those gaps, partly because they are poorly motivated, as you said, but also because they're poorly organized, and they don't really have the capacity to break through those gaps or seize sizable amounts of territory that would add up to a strategic victory. And so what we see is sort of this infiltration across the front line of, in some places Ukraine has infiltrated across land territory that Russia held, and in some places Russia has infiltrated across territory that Ukraine held. There's also a question of, where on the front line we're talking. A lot of the best Russian units and a lot of their effort has been focused in Donetsk, where they hope to take the rest of Donetsk. Is something that is a very important goal to Putin, or the other regions are sort of less important. And it's in other regions, especially near Zaporizhia, where Ukraine has had the most success.
So if there's no chance, or the peace talks are stalled or delayed or sidelined, and obviously the war on Iran is definitely a big distraction, and I think it's really bad for Ukraine. I mean, we're just learning now, for example, that the South Koreans are upset that the U.S. is transferring Patriot batteries from South Korea to the Middle East, and I'm not sure who's going to supply Ukraine with any more defensive weapons if they're all being used up in the Middle East. So that's why I brought up the military situation, because it seems to me that that's the focus now, that peace is not at hand.
Well, I still think there's a chance for a peace deal. I just think that the war in Iran will prolong the fighting because it gives the Russian economy second life, because it does put additional pressure on Ukraine's access to materiel, and because the U.S. just doesn't look like a credible negotiator. This is now the third time that the United States has bombed a country or attacked a country while they were in negotiations with them. Iran in June, Maduro in January, and now again Iran a second time. So if you're Russian, even if you're Ukrainian, what's your confidence that the United States is actually mediating here in good faith and is going to deliver on whatever promises it offers to try to get to a deal? So in my mind, that's also a limit. Now, I do think we're getting sort of close to a point where both Ukraine and Russia will find benefits in peace over continuing to fight. But I agree with you that, at least for the very near term, the fight is likely to continue, and the battlefield is where the focus will be. I don't think that the lines are going to change all that much. I'm not expecting a cascade either way, which is unfortunate, because that means that in 6 months, we'll be talking about basically the same deal on the table, the same sets of security guarantees, territory almost exactly the same, except more people will have lost their lives and more weapons and money will have been expended. So it's a really unfortunate situation that only gets worse the longer the war in Iran continues.
Jennifer Kavanaugh, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Jennifer Kavanaugh, who's a Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, where her research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure and defense budgeting, and defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Previously, she was a Senior Fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Is Ukraine Peace Toast Now That the Middle East is on Fire? And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes out.